Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we'll travel through 2,000 years of the Chinese Empire, a place where hundreds of kings rose to the throne, lived, ruled, and then had their names carved into stone steles, with praise as long-winded as luxury real estate ads. But only one woman had her name carved not as empress, not as dowager, but as emperor. Her name was Wu Zetian. Her story is not a fairy tale. It's a chronicle, cold, ruthless, and eerily effective. A woman, power-hungry, who killed her own child, poisoned relatives, manipulated Buddhism, and ascended to the highest throne, quietly climbing over the bodies. Before we begin, if you find this a worthy shelter at 2 a.m, hit like and subscribe. Like the rule in an old tavern, only order when you truly need a quiet place. What I love most is reading the comments, seeing where you're from and what time it is. New York or Norway, 1 a.m. or 5 a.m. You're still here, and I see you. Now, turn off the lights, switch on a small fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but because that soft buzzing helps us forget the ghosts of the imperial court. The year is 637, and the girl, 13 years old, is chosen to enter the palace of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty, then ruling over an empire as vast as the East Asian galaxy. Her name is Wu Zhao, youngest daughter of a mid-level official family from Shaanxi. Not poor enough to be ignored, but not powerful enough to be protected. She's listed among the selected consorts like a new piece of palace furniture. No one asked whether she agreed. In the palace, she is given the title Karen, a low-ranking concubine. Karen, loosely speaking, is a consort put aside, pretty enough to be summoned, but otherwise a walking ornament. The Tang court wasn't like those romantic historical dramas with elegant background music. It was a machine of power fueled by the silence of hundreds of women, each living like a quiet shadow. They wore makeup to be seen, smile to be remembered, and those who stayed silent too long slowly faded into the background. Wu Zhao, however, was different. She didn't scream, nor did she vanish. Instead of applying lipstick, she studied characters. Instead of scheming, she read books. While others pinned hair ornaments, she dipped her brush into ink, as if writing a chapter no one in history had dared to open. She stayed there for 10 years. No fame, no scandal, no children. Each day of a Karen like her began before dawn, with the bells rung by palace servants. Breakfast was thin porridge, eaten in silence. Then came the makeup routine, not for going out, but to be ready in case. She was summoned. The entire harem was like a vast stage with hundreds of performers waiting for their turn, though most never got to perform. Some days, Wu Zhao just read and wrote poetry, using words as her only way not to dissolve into the air. And those poems, no one read. But she wrote anyway, like sending letters to the future. Then, in the year 649, Emperor Taizong passed away. According to palace law, concubines who hadn't borne children would be sent to a convent, not because they had a spiritual calling, but because they had outlived their purpose. They'd be taken to a temple, in this case, the Ganye temple, which specialized in receiving leftover consorts, shaved bald, dressed in grey robes, and left to live the rest of their lives as fading shadows beneath Buddha statues. Wu Zhao, at 25, was buried in a place with no name, no title, no way back. Ganye temple, where she was sent, wasn't a place of spiritual enlightenment, like in religious texts. It was more like a warehouse of palace memories. Women who once lived in silk now sat in silence with wooden fish clappers, as if keeping rhythm for history's forgetfulness. No one built statues for them. They built statues for Buddha, and whoever survived those years had learned how to vanish without dying. It wasn't a fall into darkness. It was being filed into the drawer of history as an unnecessary object. But the strange thing is, she didn't dissolve. She didn't resent. She didn't rebel. She simply existed, like ash at the bottom of a furnace, still retaining heat. One day, all it needed was a gust of wind, and everything would reignite. And the wind came. A man came to visit the temple. His name was Li Ji, now Emperor Gaozong of Tang, the successor. Wu Zhao had once cradled him when he was a young prince, and he still remembered her. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a quiet bond between two people, once swallowed by the palace. And now, together, they would rewrite the game. The girl, once discarded into a temple, was about to return to the palace, but this time not as furniture, but as the one who would rearrange the entire room. The year is 654. The capital, Chang'an, is in the midst of winter. The wind cuts like blades, and a silent carriage enters through a side gate of the imperial palace. Inside the carriage is a woman who had been taken away from this place 5 years ago. No drums, no trumpets, only the faint breath of someone who had once been erased by history. Wu Zhao had returned, the one who returned, and the one who summoned her. No one dared call her Kirin anymore. According to Tang Dynasty court law, a concubine who had become a nun could not return to the harem. It was like being removed from the record of existence, not only in the court, but also in society. But in the year 654, Li Zhi did something unprecedented. He quietly ordered Wu Zhao's return. No decree, no ceremonial escort. She was brought back like a lost item, picked up again. This placed her status entirely outside all legal definitions. Not a concubine, not a nun, not part of the harem, nor of the court. She existed, like a shadow, familiar yet unsettling. Her former title was erased by the verbal order of the new emperor, Li Ji, now Emperor Gaozong of Tang. He summoned her back, with memory. There are some bonds that aren't recorded in official history. When Wu Zhao left the palace in 649, Li Zhi had only recently ascended the throne. He was still young. His illness had not yet appeared. And in his heart lingered an echo from long ago. That woman once held me, when I was just a child, motherless. She did not return to love. She returned to live again, and write the next chapter of a life never fully told. The palace does not welcome those who remember too much. Back in the harem, Wu Zhao was no longer invisible. She became a threat, not just because she was present, but because of what her return symbolized. In Confucian thought during the Tang era, the ideal woman was one who follows her husband after marriage and her son after her husband's death, and absolutely should not return to a previous path. Wu Zhao not only returned to the palace, but returned from a status already considered dead, a nun. That made her a symbol of deviation, frightening to those in power. They called her a ghost nun, a sign of unrest, the shadow of a woman once removed from the game, now back, sitting at the board. And in Chinese history, no woman had ever done such a thing. The empress at that time was Empress Wang, who had struggled to hold on to the emperor's favor. And now, seeing someone once discarded return, She knew well that the palace did not tolerate resurrection. The greatest crime in the harem was not rebellion, but daring to return when you were supposed to disappear. And Wu Zhao not only returned, she returned shining. One woman, two enemies. It wasn't just Empress Wang. Another woman also began to feel her seat trembling. Consort Xiao, once regarded as the most favored concubine. These two women, one wife, one lover, secretly joined forces against the third, the old but new. They thought it would be easy. If Wu Zhao had been removed once, she could be removed again. But they forgot one thing. No one who has lived in a convent and survived is afraid of being hated. A symbol of resurrection. When Wu Zhao returned, she no longer used beauty as her weapon. She used silence and absolute discipline. She didn't laugh loudly. She didn't dress flamboyantly. She didn't act competitive. But what she did was, remember everything anyone said, know exactly when to appear, and above all, she never forgot who had laughed in her face. History calls this period the hibernation of the leopard, from palace woman to chess piece. Li Ji began to rely on Wu Zhao, not just because of affection, but because she understood governance the way she once understood every step within the harem. She was consulted on state matters. She was allowed to enter and exit the study. And then she gave birth, something Empress Wang could not do. Now, Wu Zhao was no longer someone who returned from ashes. She was the one holding the flame at the very heart of the imperial power. Upon returning to the palace, Wu Zhao may still have carried the title of former concubine. But people gradually realized she wasn't like any woman they had ever met. No one knew what plans she had then, only that every step was intentional, and this time she would not let history write her story for her. Chang'an, the year 655, a morning like any other morning. But that day, someone was no longer sitting in the right place. Empress Wang fell from the throne, not because she was pushed, but because she was quietly replaced. The Tang dynasty court had never imagined that the position of empress, the mother of the nation, could be replaced as easily as changing clothes. But Li Ji, Emperor Gaozong of Tang, did just that. Not with a knife, not with an army, but with a silence long enough for people to stop objecting. Empress Wang, once the mother figure of the nation, was deposed. The excuse was light as mist. The empress is barren, unable to bear an heir. That sentence, both sympathetic and an unappealable sentence. A coronation, but no one smiled. On the day Wu Zhao was crowned empress, the court was not festive. No one sang, no one danced. The drummers did their job and nothing more, because everyone knew a woman who returned from the temple and climbed all the way to empress was either helped by heaven or would bring heaven crashing down. Seizing power, not with a sword, but by giving birth. In the Tang court, women without children were almost nameless. Empress Wang, mother of the nation, had no children. A small gap, but a fatal one. Wu Zhao was different. She gave birth to princes. Not just one, but a string of strong sons. Their cries like the sound of silent drums shattering the status of the one before her. In a dynasty whose greatest obsession was continuing the bloodline, each full cradle of hers was a sword hanging over Empress Wang's head. And the court chose her, not out of love, but out of fear of lacking someone who could produce an heir. The greatest weakness of Empress Wang was having no children. Wu Zhao was different. She gave birth to princes. In a dynasty constantly worried about sons to succeed the throne, that turned her from a threat into a pillar, from the one cutting in line to the one chosen by heaven. And when people got used to her presence, they began to repeat something light as the wind. Maybe she should do more than just be a wife. According to records in the New Book of Tang, Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, two women who once ruled the harem, were stripped of all titles and imprisoned in the inner palace. There was no formal ceremony, no trial. Just one day, they vanished. It is said that night, a carriage without lanterns rolled slowly through the western corridor of the Changlei Palace. Inside were two women who once sat beside the Son of Heaven. They were pulled out of history, like tearing a page from a book, softly, silently, but irreversibly. There is one story recorded in history, but no one dares confirm its truth. Wu Zhao's newborn daughter, only a few days old, suddenly died in the cradle. Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang of being the culprit. Li Zhi was furious, and that was the last straw that led to Wang's removal. But some say Wu Zhao herself killed her child, then framed the empress. No evidence, no investigation, only the result. A mother lost her child, a woman lost her throne, and one became empress. Since ascending the throne, Wu Zhao did not sit still. She began rebuilding the palace, abolishing many old rituals, replacing officials appointed by Empress Wang, building a network of loyalists, loyal not to the emperor, but to her. If before she was the one allowed into the palace, now she was the one deciding who got to stay. In Chinese history, there were many empresses who influenced politics. Empress Lu of the Han, Empress Dowager Tikti of the Qing, but none of them ever called themselves emperor. Wu Zhao did not just replace, she redefined the position of women in the empire, from woman of the inner quarters to ruler of the realm, from writing love letters to signing execution orders. There was no precedent for ministers to follow, and because of that, fear rose, not because of what she did, but because of what she dared to do. To the court officials, Wu Zhao was an unsolvable problem. A woman who knew how to play politics, knew how to manipulate the emperor's emotions, knew when to be soft and when to be sharp like a surgical blade. They could not control her, so they did the only thing they could: record her as a monster. The woman with no heart. The one who stepped over her own child. The one who used blood to build a throne. History is a weapon, and Wu Zhao was its first victim, rewritten through prejudice. In the year 655, when Wu Zhao became empress, she officially stepped out of the emperor's shadow. But the first step out of the darkness always makes others squint. She was no longer the nun who returned. She was a new gravitational force of power, even though no one dared say it aloud. And this was only the prelude. China in the 7th century. This was a world where women were not worshipped, only revered as the shadows of men. But Wu Zhao was not a shadow. An empire, hundreds of thousands of people, but never once a female emperor. In 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history, hundreds of emperors, but only one woman dared to call herself emperor. Not empress, not empress dowager, but emperor, the ruler of all under heaven. And to do that, she had to walk through 3 tightly locked doors. The first door, women were not allowed to participate in politics. The second door, women were not allowed to be heirs. The third door, women were not allowed to be called Son of Heaven. Wu Zhao alone opened all 3, not with sword, not with spear, but with time, the ability to wait, and a memory that never forgot who once laughed at her. From not being allowed to write, to setting the laws, women in the Tang dynasty had no right to study politics, not allowed to learn to write administrative documents, not allowed to step foot into the Dali court, the court of justice. But Wu Zhao, after ascending the throne, personally approved legal codes, reorganized the structure of the imperial court. She established the Divine Strategy Bureau, an elite guard force loyal only to her. She reduced the power of the Li family and rewrote the role of women in official state documents, something never before seen. Instead of tying herself to the Confucian image of mother of the nation, Wu Zhao chose a figure that went beyond the norm. She claimed to be the incarnation of Maitreya Buddha, the future Buddha in Buddhist belief. No longer the mother of the emperor, she was the mother of all under heaven, not hidden behind embroidered curtains, but standing in the middle of the hall like a deity. And by doing that, she did not just take power, she sanctified it, in a very Chinese way, and a very feminine way. She didn't just sit on the throne. She rewrote what the throne looked like, how tall it was, and who was allowed to touch it. And she did something that made the nobility tremble. She appointed people based not on bloodline. Before that, most court officials came from great families, those born with a throne already waiting. Wu Zhou established an expanded examination system, allowing citizens, even the poor, to enter the gates of power if they had the ability. She didn't destroy the old order. She opened an extra door for those daring enough to step through. That's how she replanted the forest instead of just cutting down a tree. The issue wasn't what she did, but who she was when she did it. If a male emperor executed people, it was called decisive. If Wu Zhao did it, it was called cruel. If a male monarch executed rebels, it was defending the nation. If she did it, it was personal vengeance. The same act, but a different gender, received two different moral verdicts. That was the greatest injustice in ancient annals, and because of that, later generations viewed Wu Zhao as a monster, rather than a sophisticated political strategist, a symbol of fracture, and also the first to fill the crack. People often compared her to a dragon with backward wings, powerful, but always forced to fly with the southern winds of male dominance. Wu Zhao, for thousands of years, became a symbol of extreme feminism if you hate her, of a freedom cut short if you pity her. But regardless, she set a precedent, a name, a silhouette, a footprint. And since then, Chinese women knew a woman once had done it. A woman had rebuilt a physical symbol of her own power. In the year 701, Wu Zhao rebuilt the Great Wild Goose Pagoda, turning it into one of the tallest structures of the time. That pagoda wasn't just a religious monument, it was a declaration in bricks and stone. There, in every tile and arch, people saw the rise of a woman, not through military force, but through words and religious belief. Just like her throne, that pagoda did not need to scream to be noticed. It just needed to stand and be taller than everything else around it. No need for permission. No need to wait for a more open era. No need to apologize. In the years she officially ruled under the title Emperor, Wu Zhao was no longer just a woman who broke the mold. She became the one who rewrote the formula for governing a nation. No longer standing behind the curtain, no longer indirect, no longer needing to explain why she was there. She was there because she had the strength to hold back the flood from sweeping through the court. An empire that feared and obeyed. During Wu Zhao's reign, small things like speaking ill of the empress could become a one-way ticket to the frontier, with no return. Officials knew that, scholars knew that, and the common people whispered about it to each other in tea houses. How can someone be that heavy-handed? But they also had to admit, never had China's administrative system run so smoothly and efficiently. Reforms in substance, not just for display. Wu Zhao didn't just go after her opponents. She touched something few dared to touch: the bureaucratic structure. She reorganized the administrative apparatus, cutting down positions where officials were paid but did nothing. She encouraged civil examinations, expanding the system to recruit officials from among commoners. She established more supervisory agencies, and even agencies to supervise the supervisors. In that monitoring system, the censor-in-chief didn't just record officials' faults, but was encouraged to report on each other, a kind of co-workers as gossip detectors. The result? The atmosphere in court was like a family dinner, where everyone brought a voice recorder, smiling, but hands never leaving the keyboard. An empire monitoring itself, as if it knew it was likely to rot from within. It didn't stop there. She personally reviewed major legal cases, and according to records, sometimes even wrote directives herself. People called it an iron fist in a velvet glove, but that glove wasn't soft, and that iron hand never cooled. The court became a hall of mirrors, where no one knew who was who. Under her reign, rumors and secret reports became political tools. A single offhand comment could be considered treason. A poem with a word that matched the emperor's tabooed name could be a provocation. And who decided what could be said and what could not? Of course, it was her. That was the price of power, and the price of keeping it longer than anyone else. And then, people began to disappear. Some were exiled to the frontier, where winters were so cold, even longing froze over. Some died in court, their bodies taken away, their names never spoken again. In that dynasty's dictionary, traitor wasn't a crime. It was a title, bestowed upon you when you said something too true on the wrong day. It wasn't exactly one day you vanished. It was little by little being erased from the records, removed from stone tablets, buried in nameless graves. Many historians of the time, those who once opposed her, were forced to commit suicide. As for those who survived, they wrote history a different way, a way that didn't leave them lying next to their pens. The surviving historians wrote with two hands, one writing, the other clutching their own throat. Each line of history wasn't just words, it was a petition to keep living. And because of that, history under Wu Zhao resembled an ink painting drawn with indelible ink and a fear of water. If they couldn't love her, they feared her. If they couldn't fear her, they rewrote her. Later, many records about Wu Zhao were filled with accusations that she killed her own child, that she cut off her rival's hands and soaked them in wine, that she was superstitious, cunning, and brutal. But there's a question that rarely gets asked. If a male emperor had done those things, would they have been written the same way? Maybe, yes, but maybe they would have been called decisive, resolute, bold. Wu Zhao ruled through politics, through punishment, but also through faith. At the moment she reached the peak of power, China was wavering between old Confucianism and a new wave called Buddhism, a foreign religion, yet one that touched the soul of an empire exhausted by war, division, and men in power. And Wu Zhao, in a very clever way, chose to stand with Nirvana, a Buddha with the face of a woman. Many records show that Wu Zhao claimed to be the reincarnation of Maitreya Buddha. This was not a gentle statement, because Maitreya, traditionally, is a male Buddha, the one who would come to restore order and deliver the world from suffering. And now, a woman claimed to be his embodiment. If you won't accept a female emperor, then accept a female Buddha. That was how Wu Zhao paved the way for her power, not through reason, but through legend. 1,000 statues, one will. To realize this, she didn't just make declarations, she built. She built the Great Wild Goose Pagoda, a place to preserve Buddhist scriptures and the spiritual symbol of the dynasty. This pagoda was once where monk Xuanzang, who journeyed to India to retrieve scriptures in the year 627, translated the first sutras into Chinese. Wu Zhao had the pagoda massively renovated as a way to affirm, if Xuanzang brought Buddhism home, then she was the one to make it the spiritual backbone of the empire. She built pagodas across provinces, so the people would remember her as a protector of the Dharma, and most notably, the Longmen Grottos. Here, on the sacred mountainside, over 100,000 Buddha statues were carved into the cliffs, from figures only a few inches tall to one colossal statue 17 meters high. That statue, according to legend, bears the face of Wu Zhao, a stone Buddha, not with eyes closed, not smiling, but staring forward, as if to ask, "Do you still doubt me?" More than a spiritual symbol, that stone statue was also a technical feat, requiring hundreds of artisans, stonemasons and sculptors working for years. Modern experts estimate it was completed around the year 675, when Wu Zhao had nearly seized full control of the empire. A motionless face carved into rock, a gaze sent across centuries. Many modern scholars, such as Professor Angela Howard from Rutgers University, argue that Wu Zhao's sponsorship of female-faced Buddhas was not just a personal statement, but her way of redefining women's roles within the Buddhist cosmology. Compassion, in her view, was not weakness, but strength tied to unwavering resolve. Religion, not just for prayer. To Wu Zhao, Buddhism was not just a religion, it was a soft political tool. It helped her construct the image of a benevolent empress, endowed with divine mandate. It built alliances with the monastic community, a group with deep influence among the populace. And most importantly, it balanced the patriarchal forces of Confucianism. An empire could punish with laws, but it only lasts long when it also has forgiveness. And within the monastery walls, among the scent of incense and the sound of the wooden fish drum, there was a silent message. If anyone ever thought women could not rule, ask the Buddha carved in that stone. If you ask a Western historian about Wu Zetian, they might tell you dozens of bloody anecdotes, from assassinations to purges of court officials. But very few talk about the rice granaries, not poetic, not shocking, but they were what kept her dynasty from collapsing in its worst moments, when the throne was placed on a sack of rice. 7th century China was a vast empire with a population of around 50 million, and most of them were farmers, people who didn't care about politics, only about whether their rice jar at home was full. Wu Zetian knew that, and she did something that many emperors before her had never even considered: a nationwide reform of the food supply chain. Canals, the arteries of the empire. First came the transportation system. Since the 6th century, China already had the Grand Canal, a waterway linking the prosperous south with the political north. But under Wu Zetian, this system was dredged, expanded, and connected to smaller branches reaching deep into provinces like Anhui and Zhejiang. Rice barges, which we might now call early container logistics, moved regularly with stops, schedules, and cargo checks. Between the court and the people, rice became a discreet but vital lifeline. Granaries, fortresses without walls. Next came the granary system, in major cities like Luoyang, Chang'an, and in strategic regions like Henan and Sichuan. Wu Zetian ordered the construction of massive rice storage facilities. The granaries had high roofs, raised floors for moisture control, and natural ventilation. There were guards, supervisors, and detailed ledgers recording every dan of rice. The rice was sun-dried, bagged, sorted by harvest season, with labels showing the date and the person in charge of storage. Modern archaeology has uncovered a granary complex, over 300 meters long in northern Henan, with inscriptions marking the storage date, July of the year 682. Total capacity at the time may have reached 20,000 dan of rice, equivalent to nearly 2 million kilograms, enough to feed a city for over a year. In northern rural villages, people called the granaries the winter hearth, because if the harvest failed, they could still walk 3 days to get rice for survival. In Tang-era folklore, there were even oral rhymes about sacks of rice flying down from Chang'an. Even if just legends, they reflected one important truth. Faith in the monarchy, though distant, was built on very tangible fullness. Some Tang military records also show the stored rice was not only for civilians, but also consistently supplied to frontier garrisons, especially in the northwest. Keeping troop provisions steady, thanks to the stockpiles, helped the court secure its borders and avoid rebellion over the long term. Not just for eating, but for governing. These granaries weren't just famine relief. They were tools for economic stability. When rice prices rose, the court opened granaries, sold at low prices. The market calmed. When harvest failed, the court distributed food. Riots were avoided. When soldiers were needed, rice for men, no need for conscription. In Wu Zetian's hands, rice wasn't just food, it was a political lever. The old ministers could debate ethics and rituals, but commoners only asked, when will there be rice? Wu Zetian chose to answer the second question, because she knew, only when stomachs are full can the throne remain untouched. The year 683, when the sky was dry, but hearts stayed warm. In the year 683, northern China suffered a major drought. Cracked fields, famine deaths. Countless districts sent pleas for help. And this time, the court didn't pray to heaven. It opened the granaries. Rice from the south was sent up the canals to temporary depots in Hebei, Shaanxi, Henan. Over 800,000 dao of rice were distributed in just 4 months. No riots, no looting, no localized wars. No monuments were built for those sacks of rice. But it was they, in silence, who kept the dynasty from falling. A woman, and the towers of rice that quietly held the throne. History often only remembers Wu Zetian for executions, for coups. But around 60% of her reign was spent managing, building, distributing, and overseeing food supplies. And not everyone understands. Without food, there would be no dynasty left to write history about. 1 dan of rice, sometimes stronger than 10,000 troops. If you've ever walked through a rice field during harvest, glowing gold beneath the sun, remember, each grain, each canal, each dust-covered granary was the quiet heart of an empire built by a woman. In every dynasty, there are always stories hidden within thousands of stone tablets. With Wu Zetian, her ruthlessness is not just legend or the words of rivals. It's a scar revealed right from her own family lineage. Princess Yongtai and the story of the unborn child. The tombstone of Princess Yongtai, Wu Zhao's niece, was unearthed in the 1990s. On it, tiny inscriptions revealed that she lost her child due to a secret medicine used by her two brothers. Just a few words, but they opened a deep question. Was Wu Zetian afraid that child was a descendant of a rival bloodline? Was that the only way to cut off another diluted lineage rising to the throne? According to the Old Book of Tang, compiled around the 10th century, as many as 12 princes and 2 princesses were convicted of treason during the first 15 years of Wu Zetian's regency. Many of them had once been held in her arms as children. A bitter folk saying passed around at the time: to enter the palace and see her face is a blessing. To leave the palace and still have your head is luck. But at the same time, it also shows, even at the height of power, Wu Zetian lived in paranoia and suspicion of those who shared her blood. The dark side of the monster emperor in the chronicles, brothers, sons, allies, all could be eliminated. In the year 684, Wu Zetian forced her own son, considered the rightful ruler, to commit suicide by poison during twilight. The reason? There were rumors he wanted to overthrow the throne. Or maybe he was simply too independent. But it wasn't just death that defined her actions. Wu Zetian also struck down old companions, loyal officials who no longer served her purpose. She subtly used exile and false charges to remove those who were no longer aligned. A dynasty loose yet deep-rooted, but extremely effective at preserving status. And she admitted it. In the year 700, Wu Zetian journeyed to Mount Song, one of the 5 sacred peaks, carrying a golden tablet of repentance. This journey was not just a ritual, but a carefully calculated spiritual statement. She traveled with a royal entourage, monks and scribes, under the dim glow of oil lamps, all in silence. The golden tablet was personally lowered by her into the sacred stream at the mountain's base, where it was believed the waters would carry away sins. The tablet was recovered from the earth 1300 years later. Archaeologists discovered it in the early 20th century, nearly intact. It bore no title of emperor, only a humble inscription: a daughter of heaven, once lost. This is one of the rare royal texts that acknowledges fault in East Asian feudal history. It read, "The one who erred before righteousness and clarity, may forgiveness be granted." In her old age, Wu Zetian was no longer a woman of steel, but a soul who knew. The souls that had fallen beneath her hands weighed heavier on her shoulders than any throne ever could. The one who stood the highest was also the one closest to the abyss. In the year 705, Wu Zetian passed away. She was not deposed, not executed, not forced out of the palace by whips or daggers. She abdicated, a quiet and entirely voluntary act. When she lay down, the first thing they did was bury her at Qianling, the tomb of both her and her former husband, Emperor Gaozong of Tang. On her tombstone, they engraved nothing, a blank stele, no name, no merits, no crimes, no title of emperor, nor any traditional inscription, just stone. Why a blank stele? Historians have offered many theories. Some say she left it blank because she didn't want future generations to write her story incorrectly. Others say she wanted to write her own history, but didn't get the chance. But there is another theory, gentler, deeper, that Wu Zhao did so many things, good and bad, that no single line of text could ever contain them all, and that time should do the carving. Legacy, a story beyond politics. Wu Zetian did something no woman in Chinese history had ever done. She declared herself emperor. She built the Daming Palace, 5 times the size of the Forbidden City, laid the foundation for the imperial examination system to select talent, constructed massive grain storage for civilians, expanded the Silk Road, supported the spread of Buddhism, and gave women economic and social agency. She also killed many people, very many, especially her own kin. She used power to protect power, and still, there remains a blank stele. It does not say she was great. It does not say she was cruel. It does not define her. It does not explain her. Because perhaps that silence is Wu Zetian's true will. A white stone stele stands in the middle of Qianling, not to be carved, but to ask. Armed the brutality of the samurai. Etnas. On the morning of September 12th, 1571, no temple bells echoed from Mount Hiei as they usually did. Instead, there were only the sounds of hooves, armor clanking, and the crackling of fire, as if the heavens themselves were trembling. This was supposed to be a sacred mountain. Henryakuji wasn't just some village temple where people chanted sutras and ate tofu out back. It was the spiritual headquarters of all Japan since the late 8th century, founded by Master Saicho in the year 788, nearly 800 years before Nobunaga showed up with matches. This was a place to train monks, store sacred texts, and, perhaps not surprisingly, house a semi-professional army. The monks here didn't just know sutras, they knew tactics, to the point where locals joked, if you study at Enryakuji and don't know martial arts, you better be good at running. It was the seat of Tendai Buddhism, the most powerful religious force in Japan at the time. A place not only filled with scriptures and statues, but the sacred heart of the court, of monastic life, and of thousands of years of belief. But that morning, the mountain didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a giant furnace, temple roofs ablaze, trees cracking, and black smoke rising like veils hiding the gods. A few days earlier, Nobunaga had summoned over 30,000 troops from Kyoto, split into 3 flanks attacking from the west, south, and summit. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a pre-planned military operation, with one goal: uproot the religious center now seen as a bearded nest of resistance. Oda Nobunaga, the man on horseback at the foot of the mountain, wasn't carrying prayer beads or sutras. He brought fire, swords, and one command: burn it all. This wasn't a formal siege. No letters of surrender. No negotiations. Just a wave of soldiers pouring in, like a flood, like lightning, like centuries of hunger satisfied in one morning. The targets weren't soldiers. They were monks, novices, lay practitioners, and sacred texts. People still tried to run, old, young, women. But winding mountain paths were not made for escapes. Those who stayed, who didn't flee, maybe they believed, we're in a temple, we carry no weapons, we don't deserve to die. They were wrong. The samurai didn't come to judge justice. They came to erase what was seen as a threat to Nobunaga's power. In just a few hours, over 3,000 lives were wiped out. Some monks chanting sutras were skewered from back to chest like live practice targets. Some were tied to temple pillars, still clutching the Lotus Sutra, before the entire main hall was set ablaze. Children were thrown down stone steps, then shoved into the flames alongside Buddha statues. This wasn't war anymore. This was annihilation of belief by the oldest method. Burn it. And it didn't happen in the dark. It happened in daylight, with sunshine, with wind, and with the smell of burning hair. People were beheaded. People were burned alive in their own meditation halls. Children cried in the smoke. Religious masters sat in meditation amid fire. No cries for help, no pleas, just closed eyes. And then, silence. The fire that day didn't just burn wood and stone. It burned away the idea that religion could stay out of politics, like a monk's robe suddenly stitched with military insignia. That was the day books turned to ash, Buddha statues collapsed, and a whole ideology was grilled on open flame, with no one to turn down the heat. Only the sound of crackling timber and the smell of human ash remained. A September day had passed, and Mount Hiei was no longer Mount Hiei. It had become a smouldering memory, lying quietly in history like a hidden page between two lines of sutra. When the ashes on Mount Hiei hadn't even cooled, people began to whisper, "Why go after monks? Aren't samurai supposed to have morals?" And so, a legend was born, that samurai were noble warriors, living by virtue, choosing honorable death over disgrace, that they only drew swords for justice, that something called Bushido existed, like Japan's version of the European knightly code. But there's one small detail, a tiny one, that storytellers tend to skip over. Bushido was a product of peace. In reality, the concept was only compiled, edited, and framed into an ethical ideal after the chaos ended, after enough heads had rolled, and when swords were being sheathed more than drawn. Around the early 17th century, when Japan entered the Edo period under Tokugawa, the samurai class shifted from killing to paperwork, tax collecting, and being moral examples. So they needed a set of golden rules to teach the new generation of samurai, like writing bylaws for a club that had stopped fighting. The notion of the virtuous samurai wasn't a 16th century invention. It was a memoir written after the blood was cleaned off the streets. The warriors of turmoil. The samurai Nobunaga took to Mount Hiei didn't study philosophy. They studied how to slit a throat without getting blood on their shoes. They didn't carry Buddhist scriptures. They carried oil lamps, folding swords, and sickles. They left no place of worship untouched, only charred ruins and bones, because they weren't trained to uphold morality. They were trained to hold territory. If they had to burn down an entire religious sect to keep Kyoto quiet, they'd burn. If they had to behead a bunch of monks to report to superiors, they'd cut. There were no laws on the mountain. In theory, after each battle, heads had to be washed, hair combed, and placed neatly on wooden trays with name tags, to be presented to generals in a trophy display. But in practice, no one had time to shampoo corpses. In the chaos, there were cases of soldiers fighting each other over the same head. Some even accidentally took the head of their own comrade. And if the head was too heavy or dropped on the way, no problem. Just cut the ear or the nose. Ears were light, easy to pack, easy to count, and didn't fall off, like wartime coins. In pre-modern Japanese military culture, beheading was a key performance indicator. After each battle, even low-ranked soldiers like a shigaru had to submit trophies. A head, or at least an ear, a nose, a tongue, or a finger, could be counted, rewarded, and shared. And at Enryakuji, there was no shortage of heads. No distinction between monk or soldier, old or young. As long as there was hair and a neck, it qualified. Some said soldiers elbowed each other to cut off ears before others could grab the whole head, because ears were lighter, easier to carry. Glory didn't lie in an oath of honor. It lay in a blood-soaked cloth sack. Most samurai who fought in this era actually came from lower classes, called a shigaru, meaning those with light feet. They were farmers, blacksmiths, porters. Anyone who could hold a spear and run qualified. They didn't study poetry, didn't know virtue, didn't read the spring and autumn annals, but they knew one thing well. The more you kill, the more you get. So don't be surprised if you see an ashigaru yelling, "For the greater good," while pickpocketing the man he just killed. That's not a contradiction. That's survival instinct with weapons. When fire replaced scripture. In documents from that time, it's rare to find any direct condemnation of Nobunaga's actions, because official history belongs to the victor. Nobunaga wasn't labeled a butcher. He was praised as the pathfinder of unification, a man bold enough to crush stagnant forces. And the samurai, their memories were cleaned up. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as Japan settled into the Edo period, people began to restructure the image of the warrior, from sword-wielding tax collectors to moral role models. And so, Bushido was rewritten like a textbook, and the blood of the monks on Mount Hiei was pushed to the margins. But the ashes still remain. That fire didn't just burn wood and flesh. It incinerated a social and spiritual symbol, making room for a different kind of light, the light of a centralized government, where Buddha was allowed on the altar, but not with his own army. What began as a military act became a historical cleansing ritual done with matches and oil. You can erase a temple, but you can't erase the smell of ash. And so, no matter how beautiful Bushido looked on paper, people still whispered in the mountain wind. There, once burned sutras along with people. A mountain that once lit up minds with Buddhist scripture, now burned by a philosophy that said, if you're not with us, you're the enemy. Samurai no longer chanted sutras. They read imperial edicts. They listened to hooves. And when night fell, they counted heads, not commandments. If you ever thought offerings to a lord were peaceful rituals with lotus flowers and blessings, you've got the wrong century. In the 16th century, especially during Japan's brutal Sengoku period, what was offered wasn't flowers, it was human heads. After every battle, the first thing a samurai did wasn't to pray or check if he was still alive. It was to see how many heads he had just taken. Heads were reports, not evidence. The reason wasn't complicated. Heads were key performance indicators. The more you killed, the more you could offer. And the more you offered, the greater the reward. Money, titles, land, sometimes even a new wife, if lucky and the boss was generous. In some cases, a victorious battle with enough heads could elevate a nameless samurai to a district lord, from living in a straw hut to residing in a grand estate, just because his sword was sharp and his sack was big. Many minor clans saw each campaign as an economic gamble. Offer enough heads and life changes. Sounds like a startup, only you're pitching with actual human heads. But more importantly, offering heads was the ultimate way to show unwavering loyalty to your lord. No need to write essays, just submit the right neck. The head presentation ritual. After each battle, samurai and ashigaru brought the heads they collected back to camp. Heads were washed, hair combed, and placed on wooden trays labelled with the name of the one who brought it, like a blood-soaked exam paper. Then came the viewing ceremony, usually held in the camp courtyard. Generals, officials, and sometimes even the Lord himself would walk past each tray inspecting. Not just judging by appearance, they would also smell. According to some records, people assessed a head's value based on the smoothness of its forehead, the style of its top knot, or, believe it or not, the scent of a fresh head. The head of an enemy general was said to carry heavier energy, have a lasting fragrance, and look more dignified. Though really, after a few hours in the sun, they all turned gooey just the same. Oh, this one seems important. This one looks like a civilian. Why's the ear missing? You'd be surprised at how professionally cold the ceremony was, like an art exhibit. The cheaters and their price. Of course, if rewards existed, so did fraud. Some soldiers decapitated sentries and stuck enemy generals' helmets on them. Others took the heads of hostages, even children, as long as the head was intact. But this wasn't a dumb system. If caught cheating, the punishment was clear. Your own head gets cut. So sometimes, the whole head offering ceremony ended with a few new heads. When offerings became tradition, the head presentation wasn't just a spontaneous act. It was a military standard, preserved and even refined. During the invasion of Korea from 1592 to 1598, Japanese troops ran into a problem. Too many heads. Transporting them was a hassle. Preserving them was worse. So new orders were issued. Just bring ears, noses, or strips of facial skin, enough to verify. Compact, light, easy to store. Even war had its logistics. A ceremony without an audience. No one did this ritual to impress civilians. No music, no trumpets. Just the smell of blood and silence. The kind of silence that comes when victory is acknowledged. And at Enryaku-ji, after the massacre of 1571, it was said that Oda Nobunaga's officers stood in long lines presenting heads, forming a report queue that stretched the entire afternoon. No one remembers each person, but people remember one image. One man bowed, offering a head. And another, sitting higher, gave a slight nod. An offering without words. Some documents, like the Shincho-koki, a chronicle recording Oda Nobunaga's deeds, even listed specifics. 38 heads brought back, 5 of high rank, washed and offered before sunset. You can picture a clerk standing under a tree, holding a brush, nodding. Nice skin on this one. Made of flesh and bone. On Mount Hiei, people once believed that faith could stop arrows. Enryaku-ji wasn't just an ordinary temple. It was the greatest Buddhist intellectual center in Japan for centuries, producing Zen masters, philosophers, politicians, and its own private armies. Yes, the temple had its own troops, when the temple became a fortress. Starting in the 11th century, major monasteries like Enryaku-ji didn't just preach. They collected taxes, controlled trade routes, interfered in politics, and maintained armed forces of Sohei, warrior monks. And if you thought monks only fought non-believers, then, you haven't finished reading the chronicles. From Tendai to Nichiren, from Jodo Shinshu to Ikko-Ikki factions, the civil wars between Buddhist sects were once as fierce as any feudal conflict. At one point, monks from one sect carried Buddha statues over to smash the statues of the other side, declaring, "Your Dharma is misaligned." In short, this was no longer about doctrine. It was an armed version of an interfaith council, only everyone brought a 2-meter staff. By the 11th century, major monasteries like Enryakuji didn't just preach. They collected taxes, controlled trade routes, interfered in politics, and maintained armed forces of Sohei, warrior monks. These were monks wearing armor. Many even wore breastplates over their robes. From a distance, they looked like post-apocalyptic Buddhist cosplay. Their weapon of choice was the naginata, a curved blade spear, dignified enough, but also excellent for slashing through crowds. They trained in martial arts, carried weapons, and were ready to burn down enemy assets to protect the true Dharma. And anyone who thought religion meant peace clearly never met a disciplined division of monks. Not everyone was chanting sutras. Nobunaga knew this well, and he didn't come to Hiei to request blessings. He came to eliminate a power. In his eyes, Enryakuji wasn't a holy site. It was a resistance base in monks' robes. A mountain stronghold that reached down into Kyoto like a shadow lord. And if you were a military leader living in an age of chaos, you understood this. Any group with troops, money, and influence outside your control was an enemy. Burning a temple was not heresy. According to Shincho Koki, Oda Nobunaga once declared, "There is no room for 2 emperors, nor for 2 governments." To him, Enryakuji wasn't a place of prayer. It was a political rival dressed as clergy. Burning the temple wasn't seen as destroying the faith, but as reforming the nation with fire, a state operation with the smell of smoke. On the contrary, it was described as pacifying rebellious monks, eliminating a 100-year-old threat, like an anti-terror campaign using axes and oil. Religion saved no one, because by then, religion had become a political force, and once political, you were no longer immune. You no longer sat in meditation and remained neutral. You were a faction, and would be purged like any other military power. The last to pray. It was said that as Nobunaga's troops stormed the mountain, burning temples and cutting down people, there were still monks kneeling in prayer beneath burning roofs. They didn't run. They didn't cry. They simply put their hands together and chanted. Flames rose, and the sound of chanting became the sound of human fat burning. In one corner, a bodhisattva statue cracked from the heat. Its stone eyes fell out, as if closing. It's recorded that the great bell of Hiei, the one whose sound once reached Kyoto, exploded from the heat. The living made no sound, but the bell groaned. Its final note rang like iron and stone, sighing at what had just happened. No one saved anyone. There was no miracle. Only one lesson. When faith becomes a tool of power, it will be burned like any other symbol. After the fire died on Mount Hiei, there were no more screams, only the lingering stench in the wind. And the victors, walking silently through the ashes, carrying their most gruesome trophies, human heads, no applause, no music, no celebratory drinks, no one danced. The samurai of this era didn't celebrate like heroes in folklore. They collected heads, washed them, laid them on trays, and silently waited to report their deeds. Like accountants after work, only their ledgers had ears and hair. Warriors who didn't need praise. A true samurai didn't need admiration. They lived in a cold, efficient, and bloody culture. After a battle, the first task was to check if they were still intact, and how many enemy heads remained. It's said that many soldiers carried leather pouches at their sides to store enemy ears, in case heads were too heavy, or time was short. And if you thought that was inhumane, they would look at you like you just asked, why not issue a receipt? One head, one silent oath. In many major battles during the Sengoku period, the head presentation, also called kubijiken, was carried out as an official ritual. Heads, once severed, would be washed with scented water, incense burned, hair combed, then arranged by rank, like an awards ceremony. Some generals even commissioned artists to sketch the most outstanding heads for record. Beautiful heads had more detailed colors. You're imagining it correctly. Portrait painting, post-war edition. During the viewing, no one raised their voice. No one bragged. No one wept. Each head placed on the tray was an unspoken vow of loyalty. It told the commander, I did what had to be done. No drums needed, just witness me. The most terrifying thing isn't a killer who laughs, it's a killer who washes his hands in silence. The art of taking heads, a bloody skill. You'd think it was simple, just slice. But no, heads had ISO standards too. Many large battles recorded disputes over heads. Some even had 2 samurai decapitating the same person, then fighting over who struck first. Some soldiers, lacking heads, stole others or used tricks, gluing fake mustaches on low-rank heads to upgrade them. Some even hired ear cutters on a bulk order basis. Don't laugh. Lords had to create inspection committees to verify the authenticity of heads and prevent fraud. Don't think cutting heads was easy. You had to strike the neck cleanly without damaging the face. Senior officers cared deeply about facial features. If short on time, they might take half a head or slice the left ear as a quick reference copy. Some chopped poorly, bringing back deformed halves, and were denied rewards. Records note identity checks by teeth, moles, and mustaches. One general once rejected a claim because the head was too burnt. He said, I can't recognize anyone without the mustache. So they went back to find the rest. This job, as you can see, required patience and a customer service mindset. When suicide wasn't a given, many people assumed defeated samurai immediately committed seppuku. The truth? Not necessarily. They had survival instincts too. If possible, they withdrew to fight another day. Seppuku, ritual disembowelment, was only chosen when there was no escape, or to preserve family honor. The problem was, not everyone was good at anatomy. Some cut the wrong spot or lacked strength, leading to agonizing failed attempts. So they called a kaishakunin, a second to complete the procedure. Many documents state, the first seppuku attempt often fails. Please try again. Some even left suicide notes promising revenge after reincarnation, a sort of karmic deadline. And silence was how they survived. There were no epics, no storytellers, only ashes, cold wind, and footsteps that made no sound. Samurai didn't need you to remember their names. They just needed their commander to remember the heads they brought back. And sometimes, silence was the most chilling story of all. Honor, in samurai culture, wasn't a blazing glory on the battlefield. It was what people mentioned when there was nothing left to hold on to. No money, no army, no way out. Just a knife, a straw mat, and a few drops of hand-washing water. A ceremony no one wants to attend. Seppuku, self-disembowelment, wasn't a poetic moment. It hurt. It was messy. It took time. There were many types of seppuku. The simple version was a horizontal cut across the belly. The more advanced kind, for the patient or those who enjoyed geometry, was Jumonji-giri, a second vertical cut forming a cross. Sounds elegant, but in reality, it was for those with both faith and guts. The blade had to be sharp, but not too sharp. If death came too quickly, people would think you hadn't endured enough. A dull blade meant pain. A good blade was passed down from father to son, like a family secret. The person performing seppuku knelt on the mat, bared the left shoulder, so the blade followed the correct path and the blood wouldn't stain the ancestral sleeve. The story sounds like a Kafka short, but it's true. Kaishakunin, the one who ends the story. A friend, or a close retainer, stood behind tasked with beheading the one who had just cut open his belly. This wasn't child's play. A skilled Kaishakunin would deliver one precise cut, not letting the head fall completely, just 80% severed, still attached by skin, called dakikubi. Still, not everyone was as skilled as in sword films. There were cases where the Kaishakunin missed, requiring a second, even a third strike. Some victims had to turn their heads mid-cut and say, "Just hurry up already." That was mercy, with control. If you messed up, you became a murderer instead of a liberator. Many samurai trained for months just to fulfill the role of the sender. In a society where silence was valued, the quietest falling head was a sign of loyalty. When death became a statement, some deaths weren't meant to end things. They were meant to be declarations. Murakami Yoshiteru, a besieged samurai, slit his belly, pulled out his intestines, and hurled them at enemy soldiers, pretending to be the lord to mislead them and let his master escape. A kind of final suicide throw instead of a grenade. In the Battle of Danno-ura, 1285, many Terra warriors jumped into the sea, armored, dragging their bodies and medals to the ocean floor. No one forced them, but they did it because they preferred to be trophies for the fish rather than for their enemies. Even the grandmother of Emperor Antoku, a boy only 6 years old, jumped into the sea with him. She carried with her 3 of the 7 sacred imperial treasures. A strange moment where devotion became national ritual and sea creatures became unwilling witnesses to the fall of royal power. Some deaths weren't meant to end things. They were meant to be declarations. Murakami Yoshiteru, a besieged samurai, slit his belly, pulled out his intestines, and hurled them at enemy soldiers, pretending to be the lord to mislead them and let his master escape. A kind of final suicide throw instead of a grenade. In the Battle of Danno-ura, 1185, many Taira warriors jumped into the sea, armored, dragging their bodies and medals to the ocean floor. No one forced them, but they did it because they preferred to be trophies for the fish rather than for their enemies. Family was a burden at death's door. When defeated, it wasn't just one person who died. Wives, children, younger sisters, concubines, even servants, all had to choose, flee, be captured, or die together. Some farewell letters were found in the hands of 7-year-old children, taught how to bite their tongues to death if caught. Some families had detailed plans. Mothers wrote goodbye notes, girls learned to hang themselves with scarves, boys hid small knives under their pillows. Back then, the Japanese didn't use the word suicide for these acts. They called it going on a trip together, as if it were an all-inclusive tour with no return ticket. Honor, at times, was a shackle, not a halo. And then, quietly, in the end, the samurai placed the blade on his belly, without poetry, without tears, just a very deep bow, as if apologizing to someone or to himself. The knife goes in, the hands tremble. A long cut, sometimes curved like an L, called Jumonjigiri, rarely completed. The rest we don't see, because after that, there's only the sound of a sword stroke, a final exhale, and a blood-soaked pile of straw mats. Honor, it turns out, is not light. It's the shadow one leaves behind. On a rainy night in the year 2025, you sit in a quiet room under warm yellow light, and the screen lights up with a scroll painting. A samurai stands still in a field of reeds, eyes closed. The wind rustles his armor. You see beauty. You feel peace. You feel something worth remembering. And that's exactly what's terrifying. The things worth remembering are always the things edited. People don't remember the 85,000 who died in Busan. Don't remember the girls forced to die with their husbands for the sake of honor. Don't remember the pleas of "don't kill me" in Korean that Japanese soldiers didn't understand and didn't need to. But people remember the sword. Remember the quote about loyalty. Remember the way a man collapsed in the rain and died beautifully. You are not to blame. You didn't start the war. No one told you to burn villages, kill civilians, rewrite history. You were just born later, reading what was left behind and sighing at what was hidden. But if you are the last one who remembers the truth, then you're also the first one responsible for telling it in full. History needs both eyes and heart. People often ask, what's the point of learning history? Maybe it's to know that sometimes the bad guys win, that sometimes the murdered don't get headstones, that history doesn't live in books. It lives in what's hidden, crossed out, or too skillfully retold. And if you forget that, history will repeat itself, only with a higher resolution background. So, then, if someone asks you about the samurai, tell them about seppuku, but include the blood. Tell them about honor, but also mention the cost. And if all they remember is the scroll painting, ask them, who's standing outside the frame? Who held the brush? Who was torn from the canvas? Because only when you remember those things will you stop yourself from becoming complicit in silence. Origin of Japanese warriors. The first samurai. Before people called this place Japan, before there were samurai, kimonos, or the art of fighting like poetry, this was just a chain of isolated islands, rising from the sea, unmapped, emperorless, and no one had thought about collecting taxes. But the Japanese, like so many other ancient civilizations, didn't let that beginning be simple or boring. Instead, they began with a sacred spear. In Shinto mythology, the god Izanagi was tasked with creating the world. He and his companion, the goddess Izanami, stood on the heavenly bridge and swung a jewel-encrusted spear down into the ocean. When they lifted the spear back up, droplets of seawater fell, hardened, and formed islands. The first island was called Onogoro. Then came Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, Hokkaido. And from there, Japan began. Sounds like a mythological Ghibli animation. Maybe. But the image of a spear stirring up an entire nation is undeniably powerful. A place born from motion and destined never to stand still. The spear of Izanagi, when it pierced the sea, didn't just form islands. It planted a symbol that every beginning is a disturbance. And Japan, from the time it had no name, was a fusion of chaos and order. A fusion that humans couldn't control, but had begun to retell through pottery, spears, and rice. Whether or not you believe in gods and spears, one thing's for sure. Japan, since prehistory, never rested. From around 14,000 to 300 years before the Common Era, the Jomon people, an ancient ethnic group, lived here. They didn't just leave behind thousands of pots with swirling patterns. They left a massive question for the future. Where did they come from? How did they live so long without founding a nation? Meanwhile, starting around 1,000 years before the Common Era, groups of Yayoi people began arriving from the mainland, bringing with them wet rice cultivation, bronze tools, and more importantly, a community-based way of life. This wasn't just replacement, it was a social shockwave. Civilization arrived not with a manifesto, but with rice. The Jomon, an ancient people, lived here. They left behind thousands of pattern pots, cave shelters, and fir-roofed huts, as if they were the ancestors of interior decorators. Then, from mainland Asia, the Yayoi brought rice, bronze, iron, and organization. Coastal rivers became rice fields, hills turned into villages, and step by step on volcanic soil, social stratification began to sprout. But this still wasn't Japan. And if someone around 300 years before the Common Era, during the early Yayoi period, stood in a freshly cleared rice field on the Kansai Plain and asked, "What is this country called?" then most likely, no one could answer. Not because they lacked language, but because no one had ever needed a name for all the scattered islands they lived on. This was an age where geography was stronger than ideals. Each valley, each shore was its own world. And that very fact held the nation back, but cleared the way for warlords. There was no nation, no Tokyo, though people already lived there. No Nihon, the name Land of the Rising Sun, wouldn't be written for more than 1,000 years. There were only tribes, small lords, and a landscape so mountainous that you'd need a very good reason to travel from one village to another. And in that picture, there were no samurai. At this point, Japanese warriors were just people who sometimes had to fight. They didn't have armor, they didn't have katanas, and they certainly didn't have a culture of gutting themselves to prove loyalty. What they had were stone axes, bronze spears, bamboo bows, and a life tied to crops, rice, and local conflict. But do you see? Even a nation born from mythology began with quiet conflicts, nameless labor, and the arrival of outsiders. And right here, among rice fields, rocky mountains, misty seas, and broken pottery shards, something new was quietly taking shape. The idea that someone must protect this order. Not a king, not a farmer, but someone in between. Armed, not ruling, but indispensable. No one called them samurai yet, but their shadow had already flickered in that first sacred spear. Around the 4th century after the Common Era, while China was flourishing with powerful dynasties, silk manuscripts, and elaborate rituals, in a place over 1,000 kilometers away, Japan was still trying to write its name for the first time. And like a teenager looking at a successful neighbor, Japan chose to imitate a civilization under warranty from the continent. No need to hide it. China was the blueprint. The Japanese adopted the writing system, state model, Confucian thought, Buddhism, and even official robes, from Chinese characters to kanji. But borrowing a writing system wasn't just about learning how to write. It was accepting a framework of expression, and each stroke was a bow before the intellectual power of China. From the 5th to the 7th century, all imperial documents in Japan were written in classical Chinese, a language ordinary people couldn't read. The ruling class was essentially speaking in the tongue of someone else. This created a strange gap between the people and the power, between speech and writing. While the common folk spoke Japanese, their history was being recorded by Chinese hands. It wasn't until the 9th century that Japan began developing its own writing system, kana, an effort to redefine itself using internal language, from centralized empire to the Yamato court, from civil officials to military officials to samurai, though at this point, still just a vague shadow. In the Yamato court, officials were ranked in strict order. Each title was numbered. Among them, the 6th rank, a low one, was called saburao. It meant one who serves. From there, gradually, came the name samurai. The first samurai in history were not glorious warriors. They were clerks, people behind the curtain, those who knew when to nod and when to step back. A state not born, but translated. In the year 604, Prince Shotoku, one of the rare names from ancient Japan still remembered today, issued the 17-article constitution, mostly based on Confucian ideals and Chinese law. Later generations called him the first to attempt organizing Japanese society by ideals instead of bloodline. In that constitution, the first article didn't mention territory, army, or taxation, but rather, harmony is the most precious of all. It wasn't just a rule, it was an anxious response to the fragmented world of Japan at the time. Shotoku didn't draw a map, he drew a psychological order for the nation. Here we saw for the first time the concept of loyalty to the emperor, the ranking system among officials, and the spirit that order is the soul of the nation, something later embraced by samurai until death. But every imitation eventually cracks. In the 7th century, an unexpected event burned down an entire history. A court advisor was assassinated, his residence set ablaze, taking with it Japan's earliest chronicles. From then on, pre-Yamato Japanese history became vague, fragmented, like strokes of ink washed away by rain before they could dry. Perhaps that's why the Japanese didn't try to become a second China. They chose another path, to imitate, then bend, to learn, then selectively forget. And this gave rise to the samurai, the long shadow of the Tang dynasty. The geopolitical battlefield between Japan and China wasn't just on paper. It erupted into smoke and fire across the ocean. In the year 663 of the Common Era, at the request of the Tang dynasty, Japan sent troops to intervene on the Korean peninsula to aid the Baekje kingdom, a dying close ally. Over 27,000 soldiers were sent, along with hundreds of warships. And at the Battle of Baekje, known in Japanese as the Battle of Hakusukinoe, everything burned down. According to ancient records, Tang forces, together with Silla, burned over 400 Japanese ships. The sea turned crimson, the sky stained with smoke and ash. More than 10,000 Japanese soldiers perished, one of Japan's most catastrophic pre-modern defeats. And though this event is rarely mentioned in official history, it became a haunting memory for an entire generation of leaders. From here, Japan began building fortresses, training troops, and redefining the concept of national security. After this battle, the Japanese emperor couldn't sit still. The 7th century also witnessed a dramatic geopolitical saga. The Tang dynasty of China requested that Japan attack Baekje in Korea. Japan hesitated, then was dragged into the conflict. The result, one of the most disastrous military defeats in ancient Japanese history, with more than 10,000 troops dead. After this battle, the Japanese emperor couldn't sit still. He moved the capital to the Omi region, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and issued an order. All officials must learn to use weapons, a symbolic image. From this point on, the one writing official documents had to learn horseback riding, and the one guarding the rice warehouse had to know how to nock an arrow. A bureaucratic state slowly became a military state, and in silence, samurai changed meaning. No longer just servants, samurai, though still unofficial, were evolving. From assistants to protectors to rulers of nearby regions. They weren't yet called warrior nobility, but in distant provinces, they were starting to become the only ones capable of keeping order. History doesn't always begin with grand declarations or skies filled with banners. Sometimes it begins with mud. Mud on the knees, mud under the horses' hooves, mud on the hands of soldiers returning from what people called the barbarian frontier, that is, the northern reaches of Japan. In the year 774 of the Common Era, the Yamato court launched a military campaign that would last 38 years, aiming to conquer the Emishi, descendants of the indigenous inhabitants living in northeastern Japan. The first battle in 774 took place in the Tohoku region, and almost immediately failed. Yamato troops had never marched through snow-covered pine forests, never camped in frostbitten fog. They brought with them tactics pulled from Chinese manuals, but no one had taught them how to fight in minus 15 degrees Celsius. From 774 to 787, the Yamato military launched one campaign after another and kept getting pushed back. It wasn't until the year 801 that a name stepped out of the shadows of the court, Sakanue no Tamuramaro, who was granted absolute power and became the first general to bear the title Sei Taishogun, Great Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo. Unlike his predecessors, Tamuramaro didn't just bring troops. He brought organization, adaptability, and something else history doesn't record clearly: cold-blooded patience. He didn't fight in traditional style. He ambushed. He set up signal stations in the mountains. He turned the forests into tactical maps. And more than anything, he understood one thing: to defeat the Emishi, one had to become partly like them. But that's a story for another chapter. This wasn't just a war. It was a forge, one that shaped the samurai. To conquer the Emishi, descendants of the native inhabitants in northeastern Japan. This wasn't just a war. It was a forge, one that shaped the samurai. When the empire sends soldiers to places they've never stepped foot in. Before that, eastern and northeastern Japan were wild lands, little rice, lots of wind, and many people not like us. The court called these people Emishi, a polite way of saying the curly-haired ones who refused to submit. But after the humiliation on the Korean peninsula, the court could not afford another disgrace. They needed a victory, and the Emishi lands were the chosen target. The campaign began, slow, grueling, muddy. More soldiers died of cold than arrows. Horses slipped, bows snapped from dampness. Each victory meant a hill captured after 3 weeks of sleepless nights. And armor began to harden in the mud. The first armor wasn't forged from iron, but from fear and cold. The Yamato soldiers, used to court music and plains, now had to learn to live in marshes and forests. Traditional armor quickly became useless, heavy, rusty, and movement restricting. so they began crafting new armor, keiko armor, lighter, made with leather cords and small iron plates. Early kabuto helmets, rounded to deflect arrows, box-shaped shoulder guards, reinforced for ambushes from above. Weapons changed too. The longbow, yumi, replaced short bows, especially effective on horseback. Straight swords of Chinese style were gradually replaced by curved blades, the ancestors of the katana. It wasn't technique, but despair and mud that forced people to innovate. But those 38 years were not wasted. Right in the mud of Kanto and Tohoku, the soldiers began to change. They learned how to fight in flexible formations. They crafted curved helmets to deflect arrows from the mountains. They swapped straight bows for long horseback bows, later symbols of the samurai. Weapons changed. Armor became lighter, more mobile. And the name Saburao, the one who serves, began to carry the scent of battle. The price of victory was becoming someone else. In the year 812 of the Common Era, after nearly 4 decades, the last of the emishi finally surrendered. But something strange happened. Many of them, once called barbarians, were brought into the imperial army. Some emishi clans were granted land, given new names, and became border guards. From once being called savages, they now wore imperial armor and received rations from Yamato granaries. A paradox emerged. Emishi soldiers fought emishi, and Yamato troops learned to shoot arrows the emishi way. Military victory was no longer about who killed whom, but about who assimilated whom, and who survived long enough to rewrite the story. And the Yamato generals, who once called them wild, now studied their tactics. A new generation of samurai was born, and right from that intersection of mud, fire and blood, the Kanto region began to awaken. Though the capital was in Kyoto, Kanto grew more rice, had more people, and sent more soldiers than anywhere else. Eastern clans became increasingly important in the military, and they no longer saw Kyoto as the only center of the universe. Quietly, the muddy lands of old were nurturing a warrior class that needed no palaces, no gold, only land to farm and swords to defend it. A new generation of samurai was born, a hybrid of Yamato discipline and emishi brutality, able to write, but also to kill, capable of reading poetry and severing heads without hesitation. People thought war was for destroying enemies, but sometimes it was just a way to learn how to become them. In mud and snow, in blood and shattered armor, the first samurai were forged in that frontier furnace. No honor yet, no bushido, no haiku, just muddy feet and a sword not yet named. When people think of the Emperor of Japan, they often imagine a divine figure living forever in golden palaces. But there was once a man who dared to call himself emperor, not in Kyoto, but in the dusty plains of Kanto. And he paid the price with his own head. His name was Taira no Masakado. A failed wedding and hundreds of beheaded lives. Don't be misled by what looks like a simple failed wedding. Behind that ill-fated romance was a prelude to the Great War that would last nearly 2 centuries between 2 major clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. Around the year 931 of the Common Era, Masakado, a descendant of a minor branch of the Taira clan, had a modest dream to marry his cousin. The problem was, the girl's father, Taira no Yoshikane, did not approve, not because they were closely related, but because he believed Masakado wasn't good enough. From that failed wedding, a chain of clan violence erupted. First came duels, then the burning of villages. Finally, all-out war between Taira branches, with the Minamoto clan jumping in. Masakado won, then fought again, then won again. And one day, he began to think, if I beat them all, then I must be king, right? An autonomous Kanto and a dream of the throne. From the year 938 to 939, Masakado controlled nearly the entire Kanto region, from Hitachi to Shimotsuke. He behaved like a true king, intervening in land disputes, appointing officials, writing letters as the Emperor of the East. Strangely enough, many people in Kanto agreed. To them, Kyoto was too far, taxes were too high, and Masakado was, at least, one of us. In a world where the central government was too distant to care, a strong local leader became an understandable dream, and the head that couldn't rest. Masakado died, but the strangest part of the story was just beginning. Of course, the Kyoto government couldn't let it go. In the year 940, they sent troops to suppress him. Masakado was betrayed, lost power, and was beheaded. His head was taken to the capital and displayed in the city center as a warning. But then, strange things began. They said the head refused to decay. The eyes stayed open. The lips kept moving. At night, it whispered the name of its homeland. Kanto. Kanto. One legend says Masakado's head flew eastward, seeking to reunite with its body. Even in the 20th century, during Tokyo's reconstruction after World War II, a construction company planned to destroy Kubizuka, the burial site of the head. The result? The company director died in an accident, a crane broke its axle, and a series of strange mishaps occurred. The project was cancelled permanently. To this day, in Tokyo, there's still a small shrine called Kubizuka, the head's tomb, where his spirit is worshipped. Office workers nearby don't dare joke about it. The legacy of a rebel and the birth of war literature. Soon after Masakado's death, people not only passed down his battles as oral folk tales, they began to write them down. The first accounts, like Shomonki, written in the mid-10th century, marked one of the earliest works in the Gunki monogatari genre. War tales. Masakado didn't overthrow the imperial court, but his story, a local man standing up against central power, became a symbol of justified rebellion. After his death, other warriors began telling stories about him, about his battles, about fleeting glory. From that was born the Gunki monogatari, war tale tradition. You may not win the throne, but if someone tells your story, you're immortal in your own way. And Masakado, with a head that wouldn't rest, became the first samurai in Japanese literature. Portrait of a samurai, before the shape was fully formed. Masakado wasn't the kind of samurai described in textbooks. He didn't follow Bushido. It hadn't been created yet. He didn't wear Edo-style armor. It hadn't been invented yet. But he left behind things that made later generations call him samurai. The spirit to fight for honor, refusing to submit to the court, a death with his head held high. More than that, he was the first to show that a warrior doesn't have to serve, but can become a center of power on his own. Some people are not born to rule, but to teach the world that to rule, one must fear those who fear nothing. Masakado is dead, but his legend still stares with open eyes. If you think civil wars are just for commoners, sorry, you've underestimated the drama inside Kyoto's royal palace. In the mid-12th century, Japan entered an era when the capital city burned, palaces burned, and royal relatives stabbed each other over a throne everyone thought was sacred, or at least tasty. a puppet emperor, and a grandfather pulling the strings. In the year 1123, Emperor Toba abdicated at just 21 years old. But don't think that was the end of it. He retired to live in a temple and began running the country from behind the scenes. This was the age of Insei. The cloistered government began. Retired emperors still ruled through descendants and supporting clans. In other words, Japan at the time had two emperors at once, one on the throne, one pulling the strings, and both belonged to the same family. Toba married and had children prolifically. He fathered more than 50 kids. The problem was, which one would inherit the throne when both emperors were legitimate? After Toba's death in 1156, the imperial family split into two factions. Emperor Go-Shirakawa, currently ruling. Emperor Sutoku recently abdicated, but wanted a comeback. Each side had supporting clans. Taira no Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo backed Go-Shirakawa. Other branches of the Minamoto and Fujiwara supported Sutoku. And then, on July 11, 1156, civil war broke out in the heart of Kyoto. Flames consumed the palace, and seppuku was born. This event is known as the Hogan Rebellion. Sutoku's supporters launched a surprise attack on the palace, met with fierce resistance. Torches lit the night. Thick smoke swallowed the palace roofs. The clash of swords, neighing of horses, cries of concubines fleeing. Kyoto became a tragic stage. It wasn't just a battle, it was a symbolic incineration of the old system. Many eyewitnesses claimed they saw court scrolls burning and flying into the air like fiery birds. Even history was being devoured. A memorable detail. In this battle, Minamoto no Tametomo, one of the defeated warriors, is said to be the first person to perform seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, to preserve his honor. No one imagined that painful ritual would become the spiritual symbol of the samurai for centuries to come. The winner becomes king, the loser is exiled and cursed. After the battle, Go-Shirakawa retained the throne. Sutoku was exiled to a secluded life, with no visitors, no conversations. They say he died in bitterness and became an onryo, a vengeful spirit. Whenever natural disasters struck, people whispered, "Is Sutoku angry?" Many shrines were built later to appease the spirit of Sutoku, notably Shiramin Jingu in Kyoto and Shirakawa no Seki. But perhaps the most famous is Ono no Kubizuka, where his head is believed to be buried. Even in modern times, many Japanese politicians avoid saying his name, as if that phrase alone could trigger an earthquake. No one wants to be the one knocking on the door of a forgotten, unforgiven spirit. Two clans, one seed of destruction. Victory in the Hogan Rebellion lifted the Taira clan and a branch of the Minamoto to the peak of power. But they didn't realize they had just planted the seeds of a new war. The tragedy began when Taira no Kiyomori started to suspect his former ally, Minamoto no Yoshitomo. Just a few years later, in 1159, the Heiji Rebellion erupted. The Minamoto counterattacked, planning to kidnap former Emperor Go-Shirakawa. But the Taira struck first. Yoshitomo was executed. And his only surviving son, a boy named Yoritomo, was exiled to the east. No one expected that Yoritomo would be the one to return, defeat the Taira, and establish Japan's first shogunate. The seeds of blood spilled in Kyoto in 1156 would bloom with the skulls of those who once claimed victory. Once again, these two clans would clash, but next time, it wouldn't just burn palaces. It would burn down the political structure of ancient Japan itself. See you in the next chapter, where samurai blood no longer seeps in the shadows, but floods the capital. On one side, a 6-year-old child who hasn't finished drawing daisies. On the other, a sword longer than his arm. In between, the fate of Japan. Welcome to the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, April of the year 1185, the final clash of the Genpei War, where two royal bloodlines of the same root killed each other without blinking. One side is the sea. The other is extinction. The Taira clan had been losing ever since the Minamoto victory at Kurikara. With no retreat left, they gathered all their forces and the little Emperor Antoku and headed for the sea. No, not for a vacation, but to place the imperial throne on a boat. Taira no Tokiko, Antoku's grandmother, held the child in her arms. The boat drifted in the Shimonoseki Strait, strong winds, black waters, and more than 850 Minamoto warships surrounding like sharks. When the battle began, arrows filled the sky. More fell into the sea than hit flesh. But the overwhelming force belonged to the side with the longer swords. Women who knew how to end the story. Seeing defeat approaching, Lady Tokiko held Antoku, the 81st Emperor of Japan, and whispered, "Better to die at sea than be humiliated on land." Then she leapt into the sea with the child, taking with them the crown, the sacred jewel, and the mythological sword of Japan. This trio of treasures, mirror, jewel, and sword, were not mere ceremonial items. They were the supreme symbols of the emperor's authority, wisdom, benevolence, and strength. When Tokiko sank them with the boat, it wasn't just escape. It was a farewell ritual to an entire dynasty, where the throne was washed clean by the sea. Taira no Kiyomori had died earlier, but the rest of his clan committed mass suicide. That day, the Sea of Japan was not only salty, but red. Later, fishermen said the crabs around Shimonoseki began bearing human-like faces, especially with the pained expressions of warriors. Some believe the soul of Emperor Antoku still drifts among the waves, becoming an angry god of the ocean. A shrine named Akama Jingu was built at the spot believed to be where the young emperor died. And there people do not pray for blessings, but for forgiveness. And after that, in legend, the crabs in that area began to bear human faces, a new capital, and a way of ruling never seen before. The victor was Minamoto no Yoritomo, the exiled child from years past. He did not return to Kyoto. He did not climb the throne. He did not need royal robes. He went to Kamakura, a seaside town. If Kyoto was the heart, Kamakura was the sword arm. This shift was not just about geography. It was about the nature of power. No longer a divine king, but a warrior who could suppress and collect taxes. There he established the shogunate in the year 1192. The emperor still existed, but was now a national stamp. All real authority lay in the hands of the shogun, and Japan entered the age of warriors. From here on out, the culture of swords, armor, and honor would replace court songs and ancient melodies. The Battle of Kurikara was where the Minamoto used cunning, chasing enemies with torch-bearing oxen. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura was where they used full force, drowning an entire bloodline in the sea. One side used trickery to survive, the other suicide to avoid capture. And between those battles, the samurai slowly took shape, not just through swords, but through the choice to face defeat with honorable death. but the sword still lies beneath the sea. Legend says the Kusanagi sword, one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, sank with Antoku. It was never found. Many believe that if someone dives deep enough and finds the sword, they could summon the spirits of the samurai who died at the bottom of Dan no Ura, or just find an octopus. Either way, the story of the little emperor and the big sword became legend. A tragic ending, but one that opened a new chapter, where swords and blood, not decrees, determined the fate of Japan. No one actually chose the profession of being a samurai. There were no application forms, no entry-level training programs, and no monthly salary. Samurai, a word that once meant low-ranking servants, had become the class that shaped the fate of a nation. But after the year 1192, something strange happened. War disappeared. And when there were no battles left to fight, the samurai began slashing words, from sharpening swords to sharpening ideals. When Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, the samurai did not rule by force alone. They began to create laws for themselves, strict and theatrical. If you made a mistake with your lord, you cut open your stomach and died. If you were publicly humiliated, you also cut open your stomach and died. If you saw your friend make a mistake, you, guess what? Cut open your stomach. It was no longer a job. It was a way of life, where the body was a manuscript and death was the punctuation mark. Bushido, the strange path of honor. From the political and bloody chaos of the 12th century, a value system gradually emerged. They called it Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido wasn't a stamped document. It was a collection of things left unsaid. Absolute loyalty to one's master, no clinging to life, living simply like bamboo, rigid when needed, soft when the wind comes, and dying beautifully. Some say Bushido is the philosophy of a man with a sword who likes writing poetry. A poet in armor, on horseback, who knows how to bow his head like a haiku. A samurai's life began in the living room. But not all were men. There were samurai who wore chest straps instead of armor. Onabugeisha, female warriors, once fought beside men, like Tomo Gozen, who slashed through dozens of enemies and survived the Genpei battlefield. Though history recorded fewer of their names, their blades were no less sharp. Samurai weren't always on horseback. Most of the time, they wrote letters, taught their children, drank tea, practiced poetry, and waited to fight. They lived in wooden-walled homes with dirt floors, beside koi ponds. Can you imagine a seasoned warrior who once beheaded an enemy in the forest, bowing to apologize to his wife for spilling a teapot? Still a samurai. Everyday life taught them patience, stillness, and a view of life as a flowing stream. Even the way they ate had to match, a swordsman's grace. There was nothing mundane about eating rice like a samurai. Pick up food wrong? Shame. Sit with a crooked back? Shame. Fail to offer elders first? Total shame. Samurai learned everything, from how to place their swords when entering a house, to how to die without troubling others. It was the pinnacle of a society that measured itself by honor and used silence as a weapon, a death more beautiful than cherry blossoms. The katana, the signature curved sword, wasn't just a weapon, it was the samurai's soul. Forged from tamahagani steel in a sacred ritual, the sword was the only object allowed to lie beside a samurai's pillow. Some swords were given names like family, some were never used in battle, only in seppuku. Cherry blossoms, sakura, fall while still in full bloom, not wilted, not faded. The ideal samurai was the same, to die at their peak, not waiting for life to erode loyalty. It was an aesthetic of endings written in blood, not poetry. In many records, samurai washed their faces, tied up their hair, and smiled lightly before suicide, as if to say, "I'm done." Thank you for waiting. When sword classes aim not just to teach fighting, but to teach humanity. But sometimes, morals got bent to serve convenience. During the Muromachi period, it wasn't rare for samurai to preach honor, while burning rival villages for a royal dinner. Bushido was an ideal, but ideals aren't immune to power. Samurai schools taught everything: swordsmanship, horseback riding, calligraphy, poetry, quick mental math, and most importantly, how to view the world like someone who might die soon. They learned to live as if every day were the final draft. Samurai were no longer hired blades. They became mirrors for all Japanese society in how to eat, speak, remain silent, bow, and depart. A ruling class that still saw itself as servants. Strangely, those who could swing a sword and behead a prince still called themselves servants. The word samurai forever tied to one idea: to serve. But that meant serving something higher than oneself. Honor, master, principle, beauty. A world where death wasn't the end, but the period on a sentence written in full. One rainy night in October of the year 1868, the gates of Edo slammed shut, not because of war, but because the era had changed hands. The shogunate, the regime that once forged the samurai from steel and blood, was officially abolished. Emperor Meiji returned, with silk robes, Western telescopes, and a declaration that shattered 700 years of swordsmanship. From now on, all samurai are forbidden to carry swords in public. When honor was forced into a display case, the sword, once a soul, now became living room decoration. Samurai, once the ruling class, were now invited to become civil servants or ethics teachers. No more battles, no more horses, no more reason to draw a blade. The survivors now lived on, like a kind of nameless sadness. Some chose to open a tea shop. Some chose to end their lives in the backyard. Some chose to write memoirs. All shared the same feeling: I was born in the wrong era. When samurai became ID photos. In the early 20th century, photography arrived in Japan, and strangely, the last samurai became models, head wrapped in cloth, hand gripping a katana, standing stiffly beside stone columns. No more going to war, just standing still for a 20-minute exposure. Those photos are now the final evidence that a class once existed, but no one dares say exactly why they vanished. There was a time when you applied for a job with samurai blood. Under Meiji rule, Japan began modernizing factories, trains, Western schools. But amidst the new waves, old samurai lineages were mentioned more than ever. They no longer held power. They became a brand. On a job application, my surname is Takeda, 18th generation, certified Bushido instructor. Manager nods. Perfect. The accounting department needs someone honest. Katana, the sword that never retires. People may remove the sword from their belt, but no one can erase it from memory. Katana shows up in everything. Modern literature, movies, video games, manga, even Japanese-style wedding ceremonies, and carry-on luggage of a few eccentric tourists. It's a memory with an edge, neat, shiny, and sad. Bushido, a doctrine that survived death. While the samurai dissolved, Bushido, the spirit of the warrior, was reborn, like a national religion without a temple. During the Showa period, the Japanese government put Bushido into textbooks, and during World War II, it became propaganda. Soldiers were trained with the mindset, die like a samurai. Question: how many soldiers truly understood Bushido? Answer: no one knows, but they all died as if they did. Samurai in the machine age. Today, you can see samurai in anime, in video games, on hoodies, in tattoo parlors in Brooklyn, and sometimes in Japanese knife commercials. But does anyone truly understand what they were? Or are they just a symbol, a ghost passing through a nation that modernized too quickly? The samurai no longer live, but still linger in every bow, in the way Japanese people arrange a meal, in the silence when needed, and in the sadness that has no name. A question no one has answered. Were the samurai truly noble warriors, or just a ruling class that knew how to tell a good story? Is Bushido a moral code, or just a poem they wrote themselves to cover the blood? Is the katana a cultural symbol, or simply a sharp mirror for a nation to see itself through the darkness? No one knows the answer. But everyone looks at them, as if they are still standing there beneath a cherry blossom, sword in hand, eyes fixed on something that no longer exists.